Orchestrated Canadian Western romance with original characters, setting, and emotional arc. Orchestrated Canadian Western romance with original characters, setting, and emotional arc. The advertisement had been folded and unfolded so many times the creases had worn through, and when Tessa Ainsworth held it up to the lamp, she could see the words straight through the paper, backward, like something she wasn't meant to read. Stockman in the foothills of the territories seeks a wife of sound character and steady hands. No flatterers. No fortune hunters. Reply to the box at Pincher Creek. She had not answered it. Her stepmother had. And the man out west, a stranger who had never seen her face, had written back a single line that changed everything. Send her on the spring train. If you're listening to this story, stay with Tessa all the way to the end, because the place she's about to go is colder and harder and stranger than anything she's known, and somewhere out there is a man who will see her clearer than her own family ever did. Tap that like button and tell me in the comments which town you're listening from tonight. I want to know how far the story carries. She was 26 years old and she had run out of places to be wanted. The house outside Gananoque had not been hers since her father went into the ground 2 winters back. It had become her stepmother's house, then her stepmother's daughter's house, and Tessa had simply gone on living in the corners of it, the way a draft does, felt but unwelcome. Vesta Ainsworth had married Tessa's father for the orchard and the river frontage, and once she had those, she had no further use for the sharp-tongued girl from the first marriage who read too much and smiled too little and had a burned scar climbing the back of her right hand from the night she'd pulled her father out of the kiln fire that finally, slowly, killed him anyway. That scar was the thing the neighbors noticed. The puckered, shiny skin from her knuckles to her wrist. The 2 fingers that wouldn't fully straighten. Spoiled, she'd heard a woman murmur at church, not unkindly, which was worse. Such a pity. No man wants a wife who's already marked. So when Vesta sat her down at the kitchen table in February and pushed the folded advertisement across the oilcloth, Tessa had understood it for what it was. Not an opportunity. A removal. He's a rancher, Vesta said, in the bright voice she used when she'd already decided. Land of his own. A widower, so he won't be particular. You'll have a roof and a name, which is more than you'll get sitting here eating my bread. Her stepsisters had laughed about it in the parlor that night, thinking the wall between rooms was thicker than it was. Imagining what kind of desperate, half-wild man would take a March spinster sight unseen. He'll send her back by the first frost, the elder one said. Wrong order, return to sender. And they had laughed, and Tessa had pressed her scarred hand flat against her own breastbone in the dark, and felt her heart going like a trapped bird, and decided. Not because she believed in the rancher, she didn't, but because there was a kind of dying that happened slowly, in a warm house, surrounded by people who looked through you, and there was another kind that happened fast and clean in the open air, and she had begun to think the fast kind might at least be honest. She had 72 hours to pack. It took her 1. The train west was a country unto itself. 3.5 days of swaying cars and coal smoke, and the land unspooling outside the window until it stopped meaning anything she had words for. Ontario gave way to the great gray shield of rock and black water and stunted pine north of the lakes, and then that broke open into the prairie. And the prairie was the thing that undid her. She had not known the earth could be that flat, that endless, the sky pressing down on it like a hand on a table. She watched it for a full day and felt herself getting smaller, and was surprised to find she didn't mind. In Gananoque she'd been small, in a way that shamed her. Out here everyone was small. It was only fair. At Medicine Hat, the other women in the car got off, and at Calgary, most of the men, and by the time the Canadian Pacific line carried her south and west, toward the mountains, she was nearly alone, watching the foothills rise up out of the plain like the land had finally decided to stand. The Rockies behind them were white and indifferent and enormous. She had read about mountains. Reading was not the same. A man met the train at the spur near Pincher Creek, and she knew him before he spoke because he was the only person on the platform, not pretending to be busy. He was tall and weathered to the color of saddle leather, perhaps 34 or 35, with a week of dark beard and eyes that had spent too long looking at horizons. He held his hat in both hands, which she had not expected, and he looked at her the way a man looks at a sum he isn't sure he can pay. "You'll be the Ainsworth woman," he said. "Tessa," she said. "Tessa Ainsworth." Holt Brennan. He didn't offer his hand, and she understood it was because she'd kept her scarred one half hidden in her skirt, and he'd seen, and he was sparing her the choice. It was such a small mercy that it caught her off guard. Wagons this way, we've a long pull yet to the place. You'll want to keep your shawl close. The Chinooks died, and it'll cool fast once the sun's down. That was the whole of the romance of it. No flowers, no flattery. Just a man in a wagon and 40 cold miles of grassland between the railhead and whatever was waiting. They were married 2 days later by a Methodist circuit preacher in the front room of the manse at Fort Macleod, with the preacher's wife and a clerk for witnesses, and Tessa wore the gray wool dress she'd traveled in because it was the best she owned. Holtz put a plain band on her finger, her right by mistake, over the scar, and when he realized, he started to apologize, and she said, "Leave it," and he did. They looked at each other for a moment when the preacher pronounced it. Two strangers who had just bound their lives together over a 30-cent advertisement. And Tessa thought she saw in his face the same thing that was in hers. Not hope exactly. Something steadier and more frightened than hope, a willingness to try. The ranch sat in a fold of the foothills where a creek came down cold and fast off the snowpack, and the first thing she saw when the wagon crested the last rise was the house. Small, low, built of squared logs gone silver with weather, and standing in the doorway of it, a child. A little girl, perhaps 6, in a dress that didn't fit and boots that did. Dark hair like her father's, escaping its braid. She stood very still and watched the wagon come and did not run to meet it, did not call out, did not wave. "That's Lottie," Holt said, and something in his voice changed, went careful. "She doesn't talk. Won't or can't." He was quiet a moment, the reins loose in his hands. Did till she was 4. Her mother died, bringing a son that didn't live either. Lottie was in the next room. After that, nothing. The doc at Macleod says there's nothing wrong with her throat. He looked at the child, and the want in his face was a hard thing to witness. She just stopped. Tessa looked at the little girl in the doorway, alone in all that grass and sky, holding herself so still she might have been carved, and felt something turn over in her chest that she had thought was long since closed for business. She did not try to win the child. That was the first thing she got right, though she got it right by accident, out of her own exhaustion. She was too tired to perform warmth, so she didn't. She simply moved into the house and began doing the work that was so plainly undone. A man and a grieving child had been keeping each other alive, but not much more. And that Lottie watched her from doorways and corners, the way Tessa herself had once watched her own family from the edges of rooms. She knew what it was to be the one observing. She didn't crowd her. The first weeks were a long lesson in her own ignorance. She had run a kitchen in Ontario, but a kitchen in the foothills with a wood stove that drew badly and a root cellar half empty by April was another country. Her first batch of bread came out of the oven like fired brick. The second was raw in the middle. She scraped them into the slop pail and started again, and on the fourth try produced something a person could eat, and Holt ate 3 slices without comment, which she came to understand was his highest form of praise. The cattle terrified her. The horses had opinions. The wind never ever stopped, a constant low roar through the cottonwoods along the creek that she thought would drive her mad, until one night it simply became the sound the world made, and she stopped hearing it. What she had, that Sarah Holt's first wife, had apparently lacked, was a particular kind of stubbornness. She learned this slowly, in the things Holt didn't say and the things his hand Amos let slip. The first Mrs. Brennan had been gentle and pretty and from a soft place back east, and the foothills had worn her down like water on chalk, the isolation and the cold and the killing work, until by the end she'd hardly leave the house. Tessa was not gentle, and had never been pretty, and came from a place that had already taught her the worst thing people could do, which was to look at you and decide you didn't count. The foothills couldn't teach her that. She knew it. So the rest she could bear. The breakthrough with Lottie came in May over a sick lamb. One of the ewes had thrown twins and rejected the second, a scrawny black-faced thing that would die without milking, and Tessa had it in a crate by the stove, working a rag soaked in warmed milk into its mouth, swearing under her breath, when she felt rather than saw the child come and crouch beside her. Lottie watched the lamb's sides flutter. Then she put out one small finger and touched its damp wool. Very gently. Hold this, Tessa said, not making anything of it, and put the warm rag in the girl's hand. You're better at gentle than I am. Lottie held the rag. The lamb sucked, and the child looked up at Tessa with an expression of such grave, total concentration that Tessa had to look back down at the lamb so the girl wouldn't see her eyes fill. She didn't speak, but after that she stayed close, and she began to bring Tessa things: a smooth stone, a hawk's feather, a fistful of crushed wild crocus, laying them on the table without ceremony, small offerings from a child who had no words but had plainly never stopped having things to say. It was Holt who watched this happen, and found, one evening, that he couldn't keep the lid on it. They were on the porch step after Lottie had gone to bed, the long northern dusk taking its time over the mountains. And he said, without looking at her, "You don't push her." "There's nothing to push. She's all there. She just doesn't trust that talking gets her anything." Tessa pulled her shawl tighter. "I was the same. Different reasons. Same idea." Holt turned to look at her then, really look, in the failing light. "What reasons?" So she told him. Not all of it, but enough. The orchard, the stepmother, the scar, and what people made of it. The laughter through the parlor wall returned to sender. She said it flatly, the way she said everything, because she had learned that self-pity was a thing people used against you. And Holt listened, and when she was done he was quiet for a long while, watching the last light go off the peaks. "They were fools then," he said finally. "Every one of them." He nodded at the dark shape of the corrals, the cattle, the creek loud in the night. "Out here a person's worth what they can do and what they'll stand. Nobody's got the leisure to look past somebody useful. You've been here 2 months, and you've done more than—" He stopped. Started again, lower. "You're not a thing somebody sent back, Tessa. Out here there's nobody to be invisible to. The country's too big and there's too few of us. You stand out front and center whether you like it or not, and you've stood up fine." It was not a declaration. It was barely a compliment, but Tessa Ainsworth had been waiting 26 years for someone to say a version of that to her, and she had to grip the rough edge of the porch step to keep her face still, and the want in her own chest frightened her more than the mountains had. The trouble came on with the summer, the way bad weather does, a smudge on the horizon you can pretend not to see until it's on top of you. His name was Cyrus Dunmore, and he ran 4,000 head of cattle on the open range to the north. And he had decided that the Brennan place, that cold, fast creek coming down off the snowpack, the only reliable water for miles in a dry year, ought to be his. He came calling in July in a buggy, too fine for the country. A big, soft-handed man with a politician's smile, and made Holt an offer that was an insult dressed as a kindness. Holt declined it on the porch, civilly, and did not invite the man down from the buggy. And Tessa watched Cyrus Dunmore's smile stay exactly where it was while his eyes went flat and cold, and she knew, the way she'd always known things, she wasn't supposed to, that they had just made an enemy who would not bother to fight fair. The first cut fence they found in August. Then a section of the creek bank dammed and diverted above their land so the water ran shallow and warm, and a dozen head got into a bog and 3 died before Holt and Amos could haul the rest out. Then the well by the house went foul overnight, slick and bitter, and Tessa hauled water from the creek for a week with a yoke across her shoulders, and her scarred hand cracked and bleeding from the cold and the rope. None of it could be proved. The Mounties out of Fort Macleod came when called, a young constable with a notebook and good intentions and no jurisdiction over a thing nobody had seen done. Cyrus Dunmore sent a ham at Thanksgiving with a note hoping they'd reconsider. Holt fed the ham to the pigs. And the whole while the cold was coming. Tessa could feel the year tipping. The cottonwoods went gold and then bare. The Chinooks blew through warm and false and left it colder behind them. The old hand, Amos read the sky and the way the cattle bunched and said, in October, that he'd never liked the look of a winter less. The blizzard came in the 3rd week of November, and it came the way the worst of them did out there. Fast, after a false warm spell, the temperature falling so hard between noon and dark that the breath froze in your nose. Holt and Amos were out on the far quarter trying to push the main herd down into the sheltered coulees before it hit. And they didn't make it back by dark, and they didn't make it back by midnight. And Tessa stood at the window with Lottie asleep and the wind screaming, and the snow coming sideways thick enough that she couldn't see the corral fence 10 yards off. And she understood that a man could die a quarter mile from his own door out here, and they wouldn't find him till the thaw. She did not stand and wring her hands. She had never been a hand-wringer. She banked the fire and bundled Lottie in every quilt in the house and strung a length of clothesline from the porch post out into the white, the way Amos had once mentioned the old-timers did, so a person could find their way back, and she tied the other end around her own waist and went out into it with a lantern that the wind nearly took, calling Holt's name into a roar that swallowed the sound whole. She found the horses first, by their noise. Holt's gelding and Amos's mare, riderless, bunched against the lee of the barn, ice in their forelocks, and her heart fell straight through the frozen ground. But the horses had come home, and horses come home along the way they know, and so she went out the gate and followed the half-buried trail by lantern and by feel. The clothesline gone taut behind her, and 400 yards out, where the trail dipped through a coulee, she found them. Amos was on his feet, just. He'd taken a fall and gone down on his bad hip, and couldn't get up alone in the drifts, and Holt had stopped to drag him and given up his own horse to do it. And the two of them had been working toward the house on foot, blind, with Holt half carrying a man twice his age, and they had perhaps another 20 minutes of life left in them when a lantern came swinging out of the white and a woman's voice, hoarse from shouting, found them in the dark. She got them home. She would never afterward be entirely able to say how. The clothesline, mostly. Holt's stubbornness. Amos's refusal to be the reason another person died. The three of them strung along that thin, frozen rope, hauling each other through a wind that wanted them dead. And then the lit window, and the porch, and the door, and the killing cold shut out behind it. She thawed Amos's hands in water that started cool and warm slow, the way her own mother had taught her, before her mother died and everything changed. She got broth into both men. She wrapped Holt in quilts in front of the fire, and he came back to himself by degrees, shaking, and the first thing he did when he could speak was reach out and take her cracked, scarred hand in both of his frozen ones, and hold it against his chest, and say nothing at all. Because some things don't need saying, and some men have never learned how anyway. The storm blew 3 days. They lost 40 head. They did not lose a person, which in that country in that year was a fortune most families didn't get. And it was on the second night, with Amos snoring in the lean-to and Lottie asleep and the wind finally easing, that Holt Brennan tried to send her away. It came out wrong, the way the most frightened things do. He said she should think about going back east in the spring. He said the country was no place for a woman, that he'd seen what it did, that he wouldn't watch it happen twice, that he'd pay her passage, and she could tell folks whatever she liked, and no one would blame her. He said it all in a flat, hard voice with his back half turned, building the wall brick by brick, and Tessa stood and listened to it and felt the old cold open up inside her, return to sender. And then she got angry, which was the thing that saved them both. "Don't you dare," she said, and her voice shook with it. "Don't you dare make my choice for me to make yourself feel better. I'm trying to keep you alive. You're trying to keep yourself from hurting." She crossed the room and made him turn and look at her. "You watched your wife fade, and you've decided it's coming for me too, and you'd rather throw me out the door yourself than stand here and be afraid I'll go. Well, I'm not her, Holt. I didn't come here soft. I came here used up and thrown away. And I have nowhere on this earth I'd rather be than this cold, hard, miserable place where I went out into a blizzard tonight and brought you home. You don't get to send me back because you're scared. I won't go." He stared at her, and something in his face cracked clean through. "What if I lose you?" he said. And it wasn't a question, it was the whole of it, the thing under everything. "I can't do that again. I buried one wife and I half buried myself with her, and that child in there hasn't said a word since. I can't." "Then we won't lose each other, Careless," Tessa said, gentler now, her scarred hand coming up to his rough cheek. "But you don't push me away to practice for it. I chose this. I chose you, and that little girl, and this whole frozen mess of a life. Stop fighting me on it." And Holt Brennan, who had not wept at his first wife's grave because he'd been too busy holding his daughter up, put his face down against the strange, marked, stubborn woman the world had sent him by accident, and shook and let himself be held. In the doorway, Neither of them saw. A small figure stood in a too-big nightdress, woken by the voices, watching the two grown people hold each other in the firelight. Lottie had seen her father cry exactly once, at a graveside she barely remembered. She had not seen him held since. She watched for a long time. The reckoning with Cyrus Dunmore came in the new year, and it came not by a gun but by a ledger, which was the truer power out there, and Holt had always known it. The diverted creek, the cut fence, the fouled well, none of it could be proved against the man himself. But the constable from Fort Macleod was young and stubborn and offended in his sense of order. And over the winter he had quietly gathered the things a soft-handed man like Dunmore never thought to cover. The names of the two drifters he'd hired and paid, one of whom had wintered drunk and talkative in a Macleod saloon. The dam upstream that sat, it turned out, on Crown land, Dunmore had no right to touch. The foreman who'd kept honest books and didn't care to hang for his employer. By spring there were charges and a hearing, and the fine soft smile finally came off Cyrus Dunmore's face for good in a courtroom that smelled of wet wool and wood smoke. And he sold out and went south to the American ranges where a man could still buy his way clear, and the creek ran cold and full, and theirs. It was that same spring that the letter came from Ontario. Tessa knew the hand before she opened it. Her stepmother's, the careful copperplate Vesta used for occasions. She read it standing in the yard with the wind tugging at the page, and Holt watched her face and reached for his rifle out of habit, before he caught himself. The letter was a marvel of its kind. There had been, Vesta wrote, difficulties. The orchard had failed 2 seasons running. The river frontage had been a poorer thing than they'd reckoned. The elder stepsister's marriage had not come off, and the younger's husband had proved a drinker. Times were hard. And it had occurred to Vesta, being family after all, whatever our differences, that perhaps Tessa, who they all heard had landed so very comfortably out west with land and a husband, might find it in her Christian heart to send something to help her people through a lean stretch. A small sum, whatever she could spare. Blood is blood, Vesta wrote, who had spent 10 years proving she didn't believe it. Tessa stood with the letter a long time. Holt said nothing. It wasn't his to say. She thought about the parlor wall and the laughter through it. She thought about being pushed across a kitchen table like a thing to be got rid of. She thought, too, about the lamb in the crate, and the clothesline taut in the dark, and a child who brought her crocus flowers because she had no words, and she found, somewhat to her own surprise, that she had nothing left in her that wanted revenge. Revenge was a thing you wanted when you were still hungry. She wasn't hungry anymore. She wrote back that afternoon, and she enclosed a bank draft. Not large, but real. More than they deserved, and exactly as much as she could give without it costing her anything she'd miss. And she wrote, in her own plain hand, "You sent me away to be rid of me, and it was the kindest thing you ever did, though you never meant it so. I have a husband who sees me, a daughter who is mine in every way that counts, and the life I built with these 2 hands, the marked one and the whole one both. I'm sending this not because you wrote it, but because I can, and because I'd rather be the kind of person who can than the kind who keeps a ledger of old hurts. Don't write again expecting more. There won't be more. There doesn't need to be. Tessa Brennan." She signed it with her married name, and she felt the rightness of it settle into her like a bone going back into joint. The thing she remembered most from that whole hard, wonderful year, though, the thing she'd tell about when she was old, happened in early June, 2 springs after she'd stepped off the train, a marked spinster nobody had wanted. They were out by the creek, the 3 of them, and Lottie was crouched at the water's edge, where the first lambs of the season had come down to drink. The black-faced ewe Tessa had bottle-raised, the year before had thrown a lamb of her own now, and it tottered at the water on legs like new sticks. And Lottie was watching it with that grave total concentration she gave to all small living things. The lamb put a foot wrong and went into the cold creek with a splash and a panicked bleat, and Tessa started forward and stopped, because Lottie had already moved, already scooped the dripping creature up out of the water and clutched it to her chest and into the sudden quiet. Clear as a bell over the rush of the creek, the child said, "I've got you." 3 words. The first in 2 years. said not to a person but to a frightened lamb, in a voice rusty from disuse and absolutely certain, and Holt went so still beside Tessa that she could feel him not breathing, and Tessa took his hand, her scarred one in his, where it always went now, and held it hard, and neither of them moved or spoke or did anything at all to break the moment, because they had both learned, in their separate hard ways, that some things you don't reach for. You just stand still and let them come to you. Lottie carried the lamb up the bank, wet and shivering and saved, and looked at the two of them watching her, and seemed to understand something about what she'd just done. She didn't say anything else. She didn't need to. She'd start talking in her own time now, and she did, over that summer and the years after. First to animals, then to her father, then to the whole loud world. But it was those 3 words by the creek that Tessa kept, folded up small and worn soft like an old advertisement, for the rest of her life. Years would pass. The Brennan Ranch would grow into one of the steadiest outfits in the foothills, the creek running cold and clear and undisputed through all of it. Lottie would grow up able to gentle any horse in the district, and unafraid of any man in it. And she'd marry late and on her own terms, and never once let anyone tell her what a woman couldn't do. There would be more children, and good years and lean ones. And Holt and Tessa would go gray together on that porch, watching the light come off the mountains. And if anyone ever asked Tessa Brennan how she'd come to be there, this sharp, strong, marked old woman everyone in the country leaned on, she'd tell them plain. She'd been sent away once, like a parcel addressed wrong, by people who looked at her and saw nothing worth keeping. They'd been certain they were getting rid of something broken. They'd been wrong about the broken part. She'd been whole the entire time. She'd just been standing, all those years, in a house full of people who'd never once bothered to look. And it took 40 cold miles, and a stranger's advertisement, and a country too big and too hard to let anyone go unseen, to finally set her down somewhere she could be looked at full in the face, and counted, and kept. She didn't become someone new out there in the foothills. That was the part the storytellers always got wrong when they told it after. She'd simply, at last, stopped waiting for permission to be exactly who she already was. The thing I keep coming back to is how close Tessa came to never going at all. 1 folded advertisement on a kitchen table, 3 days to decide, and a whole family certain they were posting a broken parcel out of their lives. She could have stayed. Plenty of people would have. It's easier to be unhappy in a warm house than to gamble everything on 40 cold miles in a stranger's name. But she went, and everything that came after. The husband who finally looked her full in the face. The child who learned to speak again. The life that grew up around her like prairie grass. Every bit of it traces straight back to that one hard choice to step off the porch instead of staying small. I've learned that nothing good in a story like hers arrives by luck. It arrives because somebody kept their word when it cost them. Tessa didn't win Holt over with a pretty face she didn't have. She won him by getting up before dawn and scraping the burned bread into the slop pail, and trying again, by walking out into a blizzard on a clothesline. Because a man she barely knew was dying in the dark. That's the quiet kind of decency that doesn't announce itself. You only see it in what a person does when no one's keeping score. The world tends to reward it eventually, though never on the schedule we'd like. What strikes me most, though, is that she was never the broken one. Her people looked at a scarred hand and a sharp tongue and decided those were flaws. Out in the foothills, the very same things turned out to be exactly what the country needed. The steadiness to read a situation clearly, to know when to push and when to stand still and let a frightened child come to you in her own time. The way Lottie finally did, with a lamb in her arms. That's a kind of cleverness school never teaches. It's the wisdom of paying attention to what's actually in front of you, instead of what you were told to expect. And underneath all of it was something harder than either. Anyone can start. It's the staying that breaks people. The second winter, the fouled well, the night old Amos nearly froze in a coulee. Tessa stayed, not because it was easy, but because she'd decided who she was going to be and refused to let cold or cruelty or Cyrus Dunmore talk her out of it. So if her story leaves me anything, it's this. Don't wait for permission to matter. Be honest in the small things when no one's watching. Look clearly at the life you actually have instead of the one you were promised. And when it gets hard, and it will plant your feet, and stay. That's the whole of it. That's everything she did.